Well, I think it's pretty close to 7 o'clock. According to my watch, it's 1 minute past. You got some volume here?
Trying.
I'm going to get their attention here in a minute. Okay. I think it's really close to 7 o'clock. My watch says 1 after, and we've got some other people down here that are cracking the whip with me, and they're telling me that it's 5 after. And so I just wanted to thank everyone for turning out again for our Hoosier Homestead series. I guess the first thing that I want to mention, if you look in the back of the room, you'll find a Reducing Stress series. And so if any of you feel like you have any stress, Don Alter, he probably hopes that this would really happen in between the time he has to present his next week, because he's feeling stress for next week. But anyway, if you are interested in that, make sure that you pick up one of these applications. That's going to be a nice series as well. And we have one session tonight on the Haskell farm, and then we'll have one more session next week, and that's going to be Don and Dale Alter and also June Pullins-Lang on their farms. And so I think that those will be interesting as well. And with no further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Neil Haskell. It's funny because I've been introducing people as professor, and this is the first time I get to say professor, and it really is. And so we have Professor Neil Haskell and his daughter, Chrissy Haskell, and they're going to present the information on this farm. So let's give them a round of applause.
Well, thank you, Mike, and thank you, fellow citizens of Rensselaer, for braving the snow, ice, sleet, and the weather of February, Indiana, to come out and listen to stories of the Haskell farms and other historic things. Originally, I thought I'd almost gotten out of this one because I had a subpoena for a murder trial down in Pensacola yesterday and today. And when Anita Reisner had asked me to participate in this series, we were doing the Vietnam series at the time. And I was pretty cranked up about that, and I thought, and she says, well, Neil, your farm is the Haskell Homestead and so forth, and would you mind helping us out? I said, well, fine. And that was finally after I said fine, and 3 minutes later I realized, what in the world am I going to talk about for an hour and a half or so about a 40-acre farm? And so I started to have some misgivings about that at that point. And then this subpoena came up, and I thought, wow, this is really great. So I called Mike and said, I don't think I'm going to be here because I'm in San Francisco. I just got back from San Francisco, and then the week before that I was in Missoula, Montana, and then I've got to go to Pensacola. So Mike, I'm just not going to have any time to prepare. And Mike says, oh, you can do it. And I said, okay, yeah, we can do it, because my daughter Chrissy is a freshman at Purdue, and she isn't studying insects and bugs and murders and things like that. She is doing something sensible like studying theater production, theater technology. And I turned to Chrissy and I said, I'll get the slides ready. You're going to cover for me when I can't get back from Pensacola in time. And she said, oh, Dad, come on. I said, no, that's the way it is. This is your field, and so you can handle it. Anyway, I get a call just before I went to San Francisco. The prosecutor down in Pensacola said, Neil, I got some good news. He says, the defendant pled out, so you're not going to need to go to Pensacola. And I was really relieved of that. Travel sounds exciting, but it certainly gets old. So tonight, how we talk an hour and a half about 40 acres, created a little ingenuity here, and between Chrissy and myself, liking some history, studying a little bit of history. We're not only going to talk about the Haskell farms, but we're going to talk about family origins, and we're going to we're going to go back to England and continental Europe, talk about the Celts, talk about the Normans, talk about the Salem witch trials. We're going to talk about the Civil War and the drought of the 30s, and on and on. Kind of just a hodgepodge of things. If anybody has any comments or questions or criticisms about any of the things that we say, enter in the discussion and feel free, because A group like this should be open for discussion. And if you have questions, when you have that question, it's time to ask it. Any questions? Oh, I do have a story. Did you hear about the little two maggots that were making out in earnest? Think about that one. Anyway, that's a forensic joke.
Yeah.
Everybody can see that. Unfortunately, I didn't get Chrissy's name up there, so I apologize, Chris. Okay. Our homestead, the Hoosier homestead, was awarded for a purchase in 1876. And basically, pretty neat stuff up here, by the way. This is one of the best auditoriums I've had a chance to speak in, lecture in, and I've lectured in a lot of auditoriums. This is what I don't know whether anybody's had the plaque up or whatever, but this is what this thing looks like. And we've got Uncle Bernie and Butane. That's my mom. And it was awarded for ground purchased in the family since 1876. Signed by Evan By and Frank O'Bannon as a lieutenant governor back in 1992. Basically, this all came about because of Uncle Bernie. Most of you in the audience may have known Uncle Bernie. Maybe you have infamous stories, maybe just stories. Uncle Bernie was kind of an icon for Rensselaer in Jasper County. But he was, once he learned about this project of being awarded this Hoosier Homestead Act, he was very, very diligent in assembling all of the documentation. This deed to this deed to this will to this deed, and so on and so forth. And it took him several months to track down all the needed documentation to go back in the family lineage and prove that. Of course, Uncle Bernie died a couple years ago, 1995. He actually died 29 years to the day following my father's death in 1966. But Uncle Bernie was quite a guy, loved him very much, and was his partner in business and in the family for 49 years. And that's Uncle Bernie at 15. Maybe I don't know whether many of you are remembering that or not. There he is in 1929. Chrissy, why don't you go ahead and I'll just tell you next slide. Next slide. And there's Uncle Bernie after he and my grandmother Haskell had moved to town in 1949. This had been about 1950-51. He'd have been about 36 or 37 at the time. And Uncle Bernie was a confirmed bachelor. He was never married. So that part of the family lineage kind of ended on that side. But he lived there on a little house on Parks Drive. And just after that addition had been built a few years back in the mid-late 40s, I believe. And that's probably the best way most of us remember Uncle Bernie. Just a few in the 80s, late 80s, I think that was taken. And he was always doing research. He was always going to the library. I remember one of the stories of Uncle Bernie. He was at the local farmer restaurant, Janet's Kitchen, or whatever it was back at the time. And Bernie was asking people, well, where does he was ordering tapioca for lunch. He says, well, where does tapioca come from? Well, a couple of smart farmers there, they said, well, it's a crop. Uncle Bernie goes, yeah, sounds familiar. We'll go back at the back 40 and combine 40 acres of tapioca, right? Not so. So he asked about 15 people as he walked up and down the street, went in the bank. Nobody knew where tapioca came from. So he had to go to the library. And he was real proud of the new library, by the way, because there he could really do his adequate research. And so he finally got a book, looked up tapioca. And tapioca is a tropical plant. It's the cassava plant, and tapioca actually it's a starch, a plant real high in starch, and you actually derive tapioca, the little beads, starch beads, from the root of that cassava plant. And also what is interesting about the cassava plant is at certain times of the year, the leaves are actually deadly poison. So that was a story of Uncle Bernie trying to solve the problem of where tapioca comes from. Next slide. Anyway, the piece of ground that we're discussing is not the property where our house, our farm home that most of you may know, we're out on 114. That's not the piece of property that we're actually discussing in this Hoosier Homestead Act. Here we have Rensselaer. This is 114. Pleasant Ridge comes south of Pleasant Ridge down to the T. And this is actually the Gwynn. This is it says Leslie and Francis Gwynn. That's part of my family, by the way. Les was my great uncle, my grandmother Haskell's brother. But we go to the west, and Ronnie Fenwick lives about right here, I believe, about right there. And so this piece of property here, it's a 40-acre piece, is the piece that has been in the family for over 100 years. Next slide. The way the lineage works here, this original piece of property was blanked out and was, we don't know, it went away. There's always some neighbor trying to get in the act, isn't there?
Don't take my name down.
Okay. Well, you're supposed to sign up. Did you sign up?
I did.
Okay, good. All right, you're in. Bob's in. Okay. Anyway, the original land purchase was by Charles and James Watson in 1876. Then Charles took the piece of property in its entirety, and I'm not sure whether it's because James died or whether James split it off. And upon his death, went to Sarah Watson in 1881. Sarah and Charles were the parents of Elizabeth Gwynn Watson, and Elizabeth Gwynn had married William Henry Gwynn. And upon the splitting of the Watson property, there were I think Elizabeth had two brothers, and so the property was split up in that effect. Elizabeth gaining part of that, I think 200 or 300 acres possibly, in that area that we go back one. In this area of land here, and I didn't have the time to research fully how extensive that property was, but this little piece of green I have marked here is important in that there was an old school there called the Watson School, and Beulah Arnott did a nice piece in a book of the history of schools of Jasper County, and I'm going to be referencing that here in just a moment. So that Watson, we have the Watson School here, and a lot of this ground around here was part of the Watson ground. Okay, go forward, Chris. And then upon Libby's death in 1925, that remaining property that she owned was split among the different children of Henry and Elizabeth, of which my grandmother, Elvia Haskell, was then given that ground. And then as it passed on to Bernard, Uncle Bernie, and my dad, and then on to me. The Watson School was established in 1874, and basically was located about 300 feet west or east of the house that Ronnie Fenwick lives at now. And of interest, see what these old school marms had to go through. My mom, by the way, is one of the local school marms. She's down here in front, and of course Beulah Arnott is too. But I don't think it was quite as rigorous as it was back in the 1870s. Here's just a little note that Beulah had put together. On January 16th, 1874, Mr. Snoddy, how about that name? How'd you like to have that name? Mr. Snoddy, accompanied by Mr. and Mrs. Charles Watson, visited the school. Miranda Banta was the teacher. The school was in good condition. Enrollment was 34, which I think that's pretty good for that area. The attendance and punctuality were good. The fourth reader, grammar, and language were not in. Primary grades, whatever that means. What does that mean? You ladies know? What does that mean? That was the fourth. They were coming up to the fourth grade, but not quite. Okay. Primary grades had a number lesson. Higher spelling was well conducted. Mr. Snoddy himself gave a language lesson and other instruction. Now that was in 1874. So a year later they have another inspection. And it's Mr. Snoddy, let's see. Yeah, Mr. Snoddy comes back. On January 29th, 1875, it was again visited. Mr. A.H. Wood was the teacher. Order in the morning was good. House only moderately clean. Need to get the brooms out, I guess. He did not teach the sound of the letters, and Mr. Snoddy said that he would try to prevail upon him to do this. Methods were a little old-fashioned, and the teacher lacking in life. Now, how do teachers lack in life? Anybody got an idea for that? Too many words in pronunciation were incorrectly pronounced by pupils and teacher. So that must not have been a very good recommendation for A.H. Wood. He was a little old-fashioned in his teaching, lacking life. So I guess if you're going to be a teacher, you better, at least in 1875, you better have some life experience. Anyway, that's the Watson School. And a little interesting note that Beulah had found. This is Elizabeth Watson, my great-grandmother, and I don't know who this is here. Anybody recognize that person? It could be one of the children, possibly. Anybody got any ideas, by the way? I realize nobody was around at this time, but that's okay. Next slide. Well, we saw that the Watson lineage had the origin of this property, and then it goes to the Gwynns. And so at this point, Christy and I'll backtrack a little bit back to the time of the Christ, Europe, when the Celts were ravaging and rampaging across Europe, and basically the Gwynns were a descendants of a long line of Celtic rulers from northwestern Wales. And so, Chrissy, if you got some background on the Celts, why don't you go ahead?
Okay. When I was talking to my friends about the Celts, a lot of them asked me the question, well, what's the right pronunciation of Celts? Is it Celts or is it like Celts, like the Boston Celtics? And actually the word comes from the Greek word for Celts, which is Celtoid. And through the different interpretations and into the English and then now into Americanized, it's either pronounced the Celtic or Celtic.
Which do you prefer?
I think Celtic sounds better myself.
Celtic. Oh, Celtic all the way. It just sounds barbarianistic, right?
Yeah. And actually, they were the first European civilization north of the Alps. And they originated in the 8th century BC, but they didn't have the height of their power and civilization until about the 5th century BC. And at that time, to get in perspective, that was also the time that Rome was founded, the Olympic Games started, and Homer was writing the Iliad and the Odyssey. So you can get the power and the time that they were around at that time.
Alexander the Great was doing great up in Macedonia too, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
In the 3rd century BC, though, was the peak, and they went out and invaded everything. They conquered Rome and Delphi, and they moved into the Balkans. Their range of area that they possessed was from Spain to the Black Sea and all the way from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. And there are even cases found where they are in Egypt and parts of Africa. And how they got there, they were actually mercenaries who would go fight for other landowners because they were tired of fighting for their own tribes.
More pillaging, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, when you get tired of pillaging at home, I guess you can go off to foreign lands and pillage.
And many of the names of the tribes, the Celtic people, there were a lot of different tribes that went off their own separate ways, but they all had the same culture, religion, and language. And many of the names in Europe, like Paris, for one, was named after a tribe called the Parisi, and Reims was named after the tribe Remi, and Belgium was after the Bulgaria, and Bologna and Bohemia was after the Boii. And there are also like the Rhine, the Seine, Shannon, rivers were all named after, they all have Celtic roots. And also the cities of Lyon, Vienna, Budapest, and Bonn also have Celtic roots. The warriors were great horsemen. They cherished their horses, and the one horse god is the most unique and well-defined god of all the Celtic tribes. Like the rest, the tribes, they differed in what deity that they each worshipped, but the one constant was the goddess of horses. This is actually an interesting ritual, since they were great warriors. When a host had dinner at his house, and it was about after everybody had eaten, but they still had the leg part of the animal left, the host would raise that up, and it was the best part of the animal too. And the warrior, who thought he was the greatest and the best, would stand up and take that piece of meat. But if there was another warrior who challenged him, they would then and there fight to the death to see who is the greatest warrior.
We're going to have a Celtic meal over at our place.
And one way, this was also kind of interesting, one way that they kept themselves really fit and they didn't overeat and they exercised, they had to pay a tax if they were overweight. So let's just...
Sounds like something we ought to be doing right now, right? Picasso, right?
Yeah.
Guess what? Go ahead.
Their art was also a very important part of their life and their culture. Since they worship gods, this is actually a horse, and one of the horse goddess. And it's interesting how it's abstract, and they said that researchers who research the art basically say that these are the forefathers of Picasso, because the whole abstract and nothing's really defined, and it's just abstract. Some other firsts that they had, they were the first ones who used soap, and they introduced that to the Romans and the Greeks. They were the first to invent chain armor, which was really useful for them when they went and conquered everybody.
Because prior to chain armor, basically they had leather armor, heavy leather armor, and some steel banded armor. Where the chain mail came in was, and it lasted for almost 1,000 years, up until the advent of the plate mail armor. So chain mail was very important.
They were also the first ones to invent shoes for their horses, because horses were so highly respected and worshipped. They wanted to be able to keep the horses' feet safe from the hard rocks and stuff that they'd have to climb, so they were actually the first ones to shoot horses. They also made the seamless iron wheel for their wheels on the carts and chariots so that they wouldn't break down as often. They also invented the rotary flour mill. They were the first ones to promote women's rights. Women fought alongside with the men in the battles, and one of the greatest leaders was actually a woman who actually went in and conquered one of the Roman cities. And they were also the first to establish a common market in Europe, long before Europe's trying to come up with a common market now and one currency and everything.
By almost 2,000 years, right?
Yeah. The fall of the Celtic civilization actually occurred in 52 BC by a powerful Roman by the name of Julius Caesar. And he came, basically he invaded, went up north, and he just kept going. And off and on they would fight the battles, and sometimes the Celts would win, sometimes the Romans would win. But the one decisive battle that actually drove the Celts into now England and Ireland, where they stayed for basically the rest of the centuries, was fought at Alesia. And there were tons of Celts, and one big...
Tons? What do you mean tons? You mean like 250,000?
Yeah, 250,000.
And I suppose, but if they're on diets, maybe they don't weigh nearly as much as if they weren't on diets.
Okay. Whatever. They were led by a Celt warrior by the name of Vercingetorix, who rallied his men, but they weren't any match for the Romans and Julius Caesar, so they were defeated and pushed north. They're also great in their manufacture of, they were actually the first ones who invented iron, which also was important for their conquering because the swords were iron and they cut through the bronze swords. And they were great artists too. They used the art for symbolic reasons. They had necklaces called torques that the males would wear around their necks to represent that they were freeborn males and that they were powerful in leadership and their rank in society.
Give a better handle for the women to grab a hold of and lead them around too?
That could work too.
So are we done with
So
Celts?
that's about it with the Celts.
Oh, we're done with the Celts?
Right, yeah, we're done with
Okay.
the Celts.
A little note about the Gwyn family in the Gwyn name. You see these various spellings. These are all the same group, family. It depended on whether you were a male or female born to the family. I believe it was the females that had the GW. Was that right, Chrissy, or was it the other way around?
Yeah.
Yeah, the GW were the females, and the males didn't have the G. They had the W, WYNN.
And it also depended on when they came over to America, the English people wanted the Irish descendants and the Welsh people to have a surname, but a lot of them didn't. The families weren't consistent with their surnames, so one would have the different spelling, or forget the G or with the W.
So the Gwyn family can encompass any of these derivations of the spelling of the name. Okay, you're up again.
Gwydir Castle is the ancestral home of the Gwyns, and the founding of it was actually in a mountainous and wild trackless country, which was the home of the princes of Gwynedd. It was said that it was so densely wooded that a squirrel could travel from one end of the country to the other.
You mean in the treetops?
In the trees, without touching the ground.
Oh, without touching.
So,
okay. So maybe took a bus.
No, they had the flying squirrels then.
Okay.
But okay, I'm sorry, I lost my place. Llewellyn the Great united Wales against the Norman lordships in around 1216 AD, and he had a palace at Trufrig, which was a land once belonging to the fortified watchtower that was built in the 14th century.
You ought to see some of these Gaelic spellings. It's tough to
It's awful.
Yeah, it's awful. They forget about vowels. They just kind of put a bunch of consonants together, and so Chrissy's trying to come up with the pronunciations.
And I don't speak Gaelic either, French. In 1515, the property was sold to the owner of Dolwyddelan Castle, who commenced the building of the house, which is now known as the Gwydir Castle. The house was completed then by his son John Gwyn, and for 200 years it was the principal seat of the Gwyn family.
Okay, a little bit of geography here. This is the Irish Sea. Here's Liverpool. We're on the west side of England, or west side of Great Britain. And Liverpool here, so we're coming west. This is Wales. Here's a coastal town. See the double, you have a big L, little L? That in Welsh, that's pronounced as a KL, Cla. So that would be Llandudno. And this is one of the close, Conway and Llandudno are close to the area where our castle is located, which is right here. Here we have a double L again, and that's pronounced Llanrwst, Wales. And just outside of Llanrwst is, probably right here, is Gwydir Castle. A little bit larger scale map. We have Conway coming out of here, and this gives, if any of you are traveling in Wales, you may want to stop by Old Gwydir Castle. It has now just recently been turned into a wonderful bed and breakfast. Cost of about $85 a night, and you get that's a pretty good deal for the British Isles. Okay, Chris, go ahead.
This is a view from the castle itself of the little town of Clanhurst from the castle, and how that would be the area that they ruled and the land ownership of. In 1990, I went with my mother and grandmother and aunt and uncle to Wales and England, and we actually went and we saw the castle. It was closed at the time we were there, but I got up on the wall and I got to look over the wall, and they have a sign out there where it says Whittier Castle. And this is the castle itself.
Now, when they were there in 1990, the castle was for sale, and my mom actually said, "Well, maybe we ought to buy this for historical reasons." And really, I thought it was a pretty good buy. About $350,000 for the castle. You got a chapel with your castle. I think 350 head of sheep and a rolling countryside. And I don't know how many serfs you got with it, but Mom said, "Well, I could sell my house in Rensselaer and move here." And I told Mom, I said, "Well, unless you're a coal miner's daughter, I don't think we should do that."
This is the inside of it. When we were there, it was, as Dad said, for sale, and the previous owner had taken everything of value in it and had sold it because he had opened it for tours, but it hadn't made a lot of money. So he took everything, he sold it, and he turned it into like a house of horrors, and he had tours in the basement and in the dungeon, and people said it was just hideous that he had destroyed a great landmark and made it like a cheap tourist attraction out of it.
Many of the original furniture had been in the castle up until 1980, 85 or 86. This is a part of the Great Hall, the Great Dining Hall at Whittier Castle.
They had the castle, and then up in the hills some miles away they had the summer home, which they built, which was smaller and quainter, and they had a chapel by that. And today the forest rangers actually took the house and converted it into their headquarters, but the chapel is still there. And
I wonder if those squirrels are going to be in trouble as they go from tree to tree.
And we stopped at the forest rangery, and we went in there, and I asked, I said, "Hi, I'm from America, and I'm relatives of the Gwynns who own the castle and the chapel, and could we go in and see it?" And they're like, "Sure. We don't have very many people request to see that, but yeah, okay." And so they gave us the key, and we went into the chapel, and it was really neat. They had a history plaque of where things came from and how it was founded. And that's the entrance of...
And they gave you a great big skeleton key. Say, "Here you go. You can take the key, go over." And so Chrissy had the opportunity to use a big old skeleton key on the chapel door.
So now we're going to America.
Okay, so we see where the origins of the Gwynn family started with Whittier Castle, Northwest Wales. And in about, I think it was 1611, 1612, Owen Gwynn traveled to Virginia, Virginia colonies, Jamestown, that area, and his son, Hugh Gwynn, then was the first permanent Gwynn resident of the New World, settling in the Virginia colonies in 1632. He was then a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses of Jamestown for almost 40 years, almost like Strom Thurmond and some of those folks in our house. During this time, of course, they were fighting. Some of the Indian Wars were going on during this period, and expansion into the western United States, or western North America. We have a Robert Gwynn, which was descended from Owen and the other Gwynns in Virginia, traveling down and establishing in North Carolina in 1715. And this is who we are direct descendants of.
Actually, Robert Gwynn was from a different branch. He wasn't a descendant of...
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness. Oh, I got that one wrong tonight.
Owen Gwynn was the first one.
Right.
First Gwynn in America, but then Robert Gwynn different descendant came
Oh, different.
over.
Okay, different lineage, huh?
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry.
Anyway, from Robert Gwynn, then came John Gwynn. We get to Jasper County pretty early. John Gwynn was a descendant of Robert Gwynn, born in 1784, and had moved to Jefferson County, Tennessee, which is Jefferson City, which is just east of Knoxville, Tennessee, just through the Cumberland Gap, and was married to Charity Mills in 1810. What was interesting was that in my forensic work, I have a place, and maybe some of you have heard about it, the place called the Body Farm at Knoxville, Tennessee. There was a novel, a book written by Patricia Cornwell called The Body Farm, and so I spent several summers down in Knoxville at the Body Farm studying. The reason we call it the Body Farm is because it's the only place in the world, as far as we know, where we can actually use human remains for field decompositional research. We actually put dead humans out and watch them decompose over periods of time. And what was interesting was that I was doing a study comparing humans and pigs to decompositional rates and so forth. And the hog producer where I got my pigs from was east of Knoxville. He lived within about 6 miles of the church where my great-great-grandfather and great-great-grandmother got married, almost 200 years prior. So, or 180 years prior. So sometimes things look, the world is a lot smaller than we really think. Anyway, they moved then to Wayne County, Indiana, Richmond and Newcastle area in about 1814. Son of John Gwynn was John Mills Gwynn. Married Mary Conyers in 1839. Moved to Jasper County in 1852 at the site just south of Pleasant Ridge, at the T where Les Gwynn and then William Henry Gwynn and John Mills Gwynn had first erected the first Gwynn house. He was very proud that his first presidential vote was for William Henry Harrison in 1840. In 1842, my great-grandfather was born, and he named him after William Henry Harrison, William Henry Gwynn. That's John Mills Gwynn. And, Chrissy, you have some stories about John Mills, don't you?
Yeah, he was a wrestler.
For Jasper County. This is Jasper County folklore here.
He was a great wrestler at the time. And wrestling was different back then.
Yeah, I think it wasn't like World Championship Wrestling is today, the 385-pounders banging off the ropes and stuff. I think the wrestling of those times, you'd grab each other's belt, and then you'd kind of wrestle around, and whoever went down first was a loser. A little bit different. And then there was the leg wrestling too, what we call Indian leg wrestling. Some of that was in style. And he was also, he should have been up for the Olympics, right?
Yeah, he was a world, no. County, yeah.
County record maybe northern Indiana.
Long jumper, three jumps and then a long jump.
Kind of like kangaroos, you go boink, 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 and then boink.
Yeah.
And he had the record for the greatest distance in that type of jumping. So he was, I believe he died in about 1918 to 1920. So he had a long time here in Jasper County. One of his sons, as I had stated earlier, was my great-grandfather, William Henry Gwynn. Another one of his sons was Jesse Gwynn, which we all called Uncle Jesse because of my grandmother's Uncle Jesse. But William Henry had served as Sergeant Major and aide to Major General William Rosecrans, who was commander of the Army of the Cumberland in 1862 and 1863. And a lot of the Civil War history with which William Henry and his regiment went through is quite exciting and extremely bloody. And I do have... Whoa, I lost my talker here. Horrible when your microphone comes apart. Anyway, I found, I was in a bookstore. I always go to antique bookstores, and I'm always trying to find unique books. And I came across a book called, and maybe some of you know of it, but it's called Indiana Battle Flags and the Record of Indiana Organizations in the Mexican, Civil, and Spanish-American Wars, So it's got all the different Indiana regiments that had served in those wars noted in here. But I do want to relate just a little bit of the actions that this is 87th Indiana Volunteers. Now on the monument we have at the park, General Milroy, Grandpa Gwynn is recorded as being with the 42nd Indiana. So I did find a photograph of him with 87th Indiana Volunteers written on the back of that. So I'm sure that this was the primary regiment he was with. But basically there was a letter that was written to Governor Oliver P. Morton, governor of Indiana, in 1865 when the regiment was decommissioned. The regiment was originally, the 87th Indiana Volunteers was originally commissioned in South Bend, Indiana, and a lot of our local men went with that regiment, and many other regiments that were mustered throughout the state. But basically, this letter is from the Colonel Gleason, 87th Indiana Volunteer Commander, and he says, "In behalf of the 87th Indiana Volunteer Infantry, I have the honor to present you, Your Excellency, the war-worn flag under which the regiment marched through Kentucky, skirmished at Springfield on the 6th, and faced the enemy under heavy fire at Perryville on the 8th of October, 1862. Marched through Tennessee, skirmished at Chapel Hill on the 5th of March, and at Hoover's Gap on the 26th of June, 1863. Crossed over the Tennessee River and formidable mountain ranges in Georgia, where on the bloody stained fields of Chickamauga Creek, these colors on the 19th and 20th of September 1863 were borne by this regiment with great gallantry through the thickest of that desperate fight, the tattered folds of which are indicative of such terrible that terrible contest, in which 40 brave men of this regiment were killed on that field and 142 wounded. That would be about 50% casualties right there. Many of the wounded later to have died. Again, in the ever-glorious Battle of Chattanooga, this flag was borne in triumph in the grand charge on Missionary Ridge on 25th of October, 1863, being among the first colors to be carried inside the enemy's works on the crest of the ridge and borne forward in desperate hand-to-hand contest along the ridge, receiving two shots through the staff and several through the folds. It affords me great satisfaction to inform you that the 87th Regiment, while bearing this flag, has in every engagement in which it has acted, held every position assigned it and driven the enemy from the range of its front. Under the new flag presented by citizens of LaPorte, which takes the place of this in the field, I have every confidence in assuring you that the regiment, though reduced in numbers, will cheerfully do its duty." Signed by the Colonel Gleason of the 87th Indiana Volunteers. It was always known that Grandpa Gwynn was in some very heavy fighting, but it wasn't until we started studying the Civil War battles of the Western campaigns that we see that there was indeed tremendous losses suffered by the regiment. And what is interesting was just in December I was down in Chattanooga for a murder trial, and I asked to see the location of where the murder victim was found. I always like to go to the scene when we're doing these murder cases, and the scene where the victim was found was on Missionary Ridge, and so I was being accompanied by a defense investigator, and his great-great-grandfather had defended Missionary Ridge with one of the North Carolina regiments. We were within about 350 yards of where my great-grandfather had charged the upper entrenchments of the Confederates when we were at that scene. Again, 150 years later, 140 years later, kind of returned to the site of history. A note about General Rosecrans. Rosecrans was not one of the best generals in the Union Army. A matter of fact, he was reluctant to push the attacks, and in fact, his bumbling at Chickamauga, while on the first day, on the 19th of September of 1863, he had done a pretty good job holding the Confederates back. The Confederates were, General Bragg was the commander of the Confederate forces. but had been reinforced by 20,000 extra troops from Longstreet coming from the Shenandoah Valley area, and supplemented their forces to about 10 to 15,000 additional troops over what the Union forces had. By the second day, on the 20th, though, Rosecrans was shifting around some of the divisions in the corps and had left a spot open in the center. Well, Longstreet saw this advantage and popped right through, routing at least one half of the Union forces, and forcing them. It would have been an absolute debacle had it not been for a General Thomas, who had held a gap open to allow most of the Union forces to retreat back to Chattanooga. I did find an interesting photograph in some old photographs of an autographed picture of Rosecrans. This was in accordance with Grandpa Gwinn being an aide to Rosecrans, and so it's possible that his commander had presented him with this autographed setting picture of Rosecrans himself. Also in these photographs, I found a picture. Grandpa Gwynn's in this picture. He's with several veterans, maybe 15 to 20 veterans that have the Ohio. Back after the war, they would have reunions, and they'd call them encampments. And I'm guessing that this has been about the 20th or 25th anniversary of the Western campaigns into Georgia. And what is interesting is that there's all these veterans are standing around a monument that has the train, the General. Now, the General was a locomotive that was made famous by the great locomotive chase movie that Walt Disney did back in the 50s. And the General, and it was chased by the steam engine, the Texas, and they had an 80-some mile chase starting in Marietta, Georgia, and coming up towards Chattanooga. The organizer of that raid, it was Colonel Andrews, who was assigned to take 20-some spies, if you will, and go deep into enemy territory and cut the supply lines and communication lines from the Confederates as they were reinforcing for the Battle of Shiloh over in Mississippi. However, the raiders were caught, and 8 of them were executed. They were hanged, including Colonel Andrews. About a year later, this was 1862, by May of 1863, the remainder of the folks that had been captured that were raiders, the Confederates, I guess they kind of figured, well, we're tired of hanging Union folks, and so maybe we'll just use them in exchange of prisoners. And so I think there were 14 that were prisoner exchanged back. And this raid, the great locomotive chase, Andrews Raiders, were brought in to meet with Lincoln in, I believe it was May of 1863. And it was the first time the Congressional Medal of Honor was awarded in battle. The Andrews Raiders were the first recipients of that. And of course, the history of the Congressional Medal of Honor has long since gone on. But anyway, in this picture, probably in the late 1880s, early 1890s, were my grandfather's. And again, I don't have this picture; it's been misplaced. He's standing around, and I'm sure I can find and identify 2 or 3 of the raiders in that partook in that raid into northern Georgia. And why he was there, I never found any record that Grandpa Gwinn was part of that group, but evidently he was traveling with some of the Ohio Regiment troops and fell in with them at that point. Are we about ready for a break? I think so. Let's take a break. Is there focus down here at the podium? Okay, maybe we don't need it. Try the next one. And that's Grandpa Gwinn in his later years. Probably, this photograph was probably taken at the time of this photograph I found. That work better? Can you kill this first bank of lights? Okay. William Henry died in 1894, so this would have been late 1880s, early 1890s. Next slide. And the children of William Henry and Elizabeth Watson were Uncle Elmer, and this is my grandmother, Elvia, Pleasant Marion, Carrie Elizabeth, Leslie, that's Uncle Les, who lived down south of Pleasant Ridge, Hayes Gwen, and Ann Gladys. Hayes was, I think she was killed in an accident when she was about early 20 years of age in Chicago. And I think, if I recall, possibly in association with an elevated train wreck, something like that. Anna Gladys was a infant death. Next slide. That's a picture of Uncle Leslie Gwynn, and this is I think this is the house that's the ancestral home there at south of Pleasant Ridge. Next slide. This is my grandmother, Elvia Haskell Gwynn, probably taken at the age of about 22. Next slide. This is Uncle Marion, Pleasant Marion Gwynn. Really some interesting stories about him. He's in a Navy uniform. That's the Navy uniform of Spanish-American War. And he was with the fleet that destroyed the Spanish fleet as it made a run out of Santiago Bay, Cuba. Next slide. This is what a bunch of old Spanish-American War veterans look like 50 years later. Uncle Marion had a very interesting life in that he left Jasper County around 1900, went west. He homesteaded for a few years in Deadwood, South Dakota, where he became acquainted with Bill Cody, Calamity Jane, and Annie Oakley. So they were kind of buddies of his. And he worked for the Union Pacific Railroad, traveling across the northern parts of North America. He lived in Lewistown, Montana, and he knew many of the old Western characters that lived out in that part of the country around the turn of the century into the 1920s, 1930s. Uncle Bernie and cousin Marty Gwynn and Dale Gwynn periodically would go out and go big game hunting. They would hunt elk and antelope and deer. Of course, we didn't have any deer here back in the 40s and 50s. So they'd go out west, and they'd always come into Lewistown and stay with Uncle Marion. And so one morning, Uncle Marion told Uncle Bernie and Marty and Dale, and Ray Shoup was another guy. I don't know, maybe some of you know that name. He used to run the Railway Express here, Rensselaer. We've got somebody I'd like for you to meet. We'll meet him at breakfast. And so they go down to the local restaurant there in Lewistown, and they met this little guy. He was about 5 feet 2 tall and about 5 feet 2 around. Huge guy, around, not very tall. And his name was Ed McGivern. That may not mean much to people that are not into firearms. However, this little guy holds the record for the fastest gun in the West ever. He's never been beaten in his feat. And what he did, in the record he set, was using a single-action Army Colt, single action means you have to cock the hammer back every time you shoot. Coming from a draw, he drew and fired 3 shots at 20 feet, kept them all inside the spades part of an ace of spades in less than half a second. 3 shots from a draw in less than half a second. And he's featured every once in a while. There's a story about him in the American Rifleman or other gun magazines. But he was a friend of my great Uncle Marion's here. Next slide. This is my grandmother in later years. This would have been about 1952 to 55 in that era. This is Uncle Les and Aunt Carrie. She lived in southern Indiana. And the story was my grandmother was only about 4 feet 10, 4 feet 11. Little lady, and she had these little tiny feet, and she would they couldn't get shoes to fit her, so what she would do is go up to Murray's department store, and they would use the display models, which were like size 3, size 4, and that's the shoes she would wear. But what she lacked in stature, she certainly made up for enthusiasm, and she had run Uncle Bernie and Dad out of bed when they were trying to sleep in the mornings on those mornings when you should be out planting corn. And I think one morning she came in and gave Uncle Bernie a whole bucket of water. Makes for drying the feather bed out for a lengthy process. Next slide. Just a scene on the farm, the chicken yard. Next. What a tom turkey, huh? Thanksgiving doesn't look too good for him, though. Next slide. And again, this is my grandfather Haskell, my grandmother Haskell. This is my father, Neil and Haskell. and Uncle Bernie, Les Gwynn, and I don't know who these two ladies are. Next slide. This is Leslie Gwynn's children. We have Martin and Dale, Donna, and Cousin Marvy. And next slide. This is Cousin Marvy a little bit later, but Uncle Bernie and Dad would always get Cousin Marvy, because he was younger than them, and he was, he's in high school, and they'd get him to come over and, well, we need to put on the corn picker. And back in the old days, it was quite a laborious task to put on some of the equipment, such as the cultivator, mounting the old cultivator on the F-20s and the M's, and so Marvy was always pretty strong. Well, as he aged, he got stronger, and finally Dad and Bernie had to stop having him come over, because he'd come over and he'd twist all the bolts off. When he'd tighten them down so tight that they'd break the bolts on all the machinery, so they had to quit having him come over. Next slide. We'll move on to the Haskell family. The Haskells were originated as Vikings in the 9th century, settled the Channel coast of England in about 7 to 800 AD, and we're descended through a Nordish king called Ashkettel. This whole group traveled to Normandy then in about 935, and this is Normandy translates to basically, or Norman translates to basically men of the north, which were originally the Vikings. These were descendants of the Celts, as we saw earlier. And we have an ancestral castle, Ralston Castle in southwest England. The Duke of Normandy, William the Conqueror, was famous, gained his fame in the Battle of Hastings in 1066. And it was through Roger de Haskell. This is a derivation of this is the Norman spelling of our name Haskell, and Roger is Roger, and you see a lot of Rogers in the Haskell family. Descended again from this lineage, and also we see the Haskell name spelled Haskell or Haskell, which translates to Haskell. Chrissy, you have a story about William the Conqueror, do you not, Battle of Hastings?
Yeah, William the Conqueror, the king before in England was Edward the Confessor, who died without having children, and the next in line was William the Conqueror, or William, Duke of Normandy. But at that time in England, there was also another man, Harold, who claimed that he was the rightful heir to the throne. And a couple years earlier, he was traveling to France, and he was captured and was taken to William the Conqueror. And since William knew that Harold would have a claim, he made him sign an oath that he would give the throne to William, and William would be the King of England. Well, when Edward died, Harold reneged on his offer, and he became king. William the Conqueror was angered by this, and he decided to take his men, get a bunch of horses, get on boats, and sail over to England and try and defeat Harold and get the crown, because it was rightfully his. And also at that time, a guy from Norway who was Harald thought that he owned the throne, because back through his fathers, he made a deal with the earlier king of England that if they died childless, that it would go on to the king of Norway. So he went over before William the Conqueror and landed in the north, and so Harold's troops went up, fought the Norwegians
up in York, which is northern England,
on September 19th and 25th, and
of 1066.
And after they got done fighting them, and they lost quite a few men, then William the Conqueror landed on October 1st, and on October 14th, he fought Harold's men at the Battle of Hastings. And it started at 9 a.m. in the morning, and they fought until about 1, and they took an hour break, and that was when... This is when
we got our knighthood. At this break in the battle, Roger de Haskell brings some apples to William the Conqueror as he's sitting and recovering from the morning battles, presented him with these apples, and it was at that point that the Duke of Normandy then knighted Roger de Haskell as a knight. A little later on, during the battle that resumed that afternoon, Roger de Haskell was killed in battle. So luckily he had started his lineage before he was killed in battle. Otherwise we probably wouldn't be here.
So then William the Conqueror fought at 2 o'clock against Harold, defeated Harold. Harold was killed. There's a tapestry called Matilda's Tapestry in Bayeux, Normandy, and in the tapestry they claim that Harold was killed by an arrow through the eye. That actually they found out later to be not true, and if you know, in a history class and they say, well, Harold was killed with an arrow to the eye, actually he was killed by William's 4 of his good commanders, and they killed him, and then afterwards one of them chopped off his leg and was continuing to deface the body, and William saw this, and he got really angry, and he threw the guy out. He got rid of all his titles. He wouldn't give him any rewards, and he said, this is no way to treat, a fellow enemy. He was a great warrior. We should give him that respect. So even though he defeated him, he still respected him because he was a great warrior.
Yeah, I guess the moral of that story is it's okay to kill your opponent, but don't chop him up too. Next slide. This is the Haskell coat of arms. Now some people say this is the crest. Well, this is not the crest. This is the actual true terminology is the accomplishment, the family accomplishment. And it consists of several portions. We have, I can't see it now, but down here is the motto. We have the shield. We have these animals on the side which depict things. We have either a helmet or a crown. And then this is actually the crest. And this is depicting, this is an apple tree and with an arrow through it, which depicts the fact that the guy was, Roger de Haskell, was knighted in the morning and then killed in the afternoon by presenting apples, apples to the Duke of Normandy. In the old Norman tradition, when you were suited up in your chain mail, your plate mail, you didn't know who was who. So you had your colors on your shield. So when you rode into battle, they could tell who you were. Well, there's the Haskells, there's the Myerses over there, on and on. And so you know who you want to go out and kill, I guess. Well, I think I won't kill this guy, but I'll go over here and fight him. The Haskell motto is hate, dishonor, love, loyalty is our motto, and it's in Norman. Next slide. Oh, back up. One point. And Chrissy can tell you a little bit about. You notice that the helmet has this is called a bever, or the front face. It's a bever, and the bever's up. If the bever's up, that means it's knighthood. If the bever's down, then it's nobility. Difference between knights and nobility. Nobility were the major landowners. The knights were the guys that fought to keep the nobles' lands in their possession. So when you see a family accomplishment and you see a helmet and the bever is up, they're knights. If the bever's down, then they were nobles.
And that's also how the military got the current salute to greeting. When knights would meet each other, they would raise the bever so that they could see each other and then say hello, and then they would bring it back down, which is the current salute.
And maybe that's the origin of the British salute. Go ahead. You can do this one, Chris.
This is in Caen, which is in Normandy, and it's William the Conqueror's abbey, his monastery. And the story is that he wanted to marry this woman named Matilda, but the Pope wouldn't allow it because there was some problem with the family. And so, but William was dead set on it, and he was like, I'm going to marry her. And the Pope said, well, if you build an abbey to me, and you build one, and your wife builds one, then I guess I'll bless your marriage, and you can be king and all that. So he built his abbey.
How did he get Matilda to marry him?
And then she built her abbey.
I think that's pretty neat.
Well, she really wasn't too keen on the idea, and he wrote her a note, and he sent it by messenger, and he said, you will marry me. And she sent the messenger back, said, no, I will not. And so he got really angry by this, and he went into her castle. He pulled her by the hair, he dragged her around, and he said, you will marry me, until finally she said, yeah, I guess I'll marry you.
Talk about courtship in the Norman days, huh? Next slide. Haskells in America, we trace our lineage back to Roger Haskell. They're the Roger Haskell, 1632 Salem. We do have lines that trace back to the Mayflower through several different family names. Later on in Salem, we have, in the 1890s, we have Mark Haskell, which was nicknamed Witchcraft Mark. And go ahead, and Chris, you can tell them a little bit about the witch trials, Salem witch trials.
It started with three girls. They actually had been practicing some witchcraft and some seances and looking actually into their future, because there was an Indian slave who was into voodoo, and she taught the girls this. But they got into some really heavy stuff about noticing death and rather just possessed at times. And they claimed that to avert tension from themselves, they would blame other women in the community that they were witches and they had been cursing them. And it's interesting that the three girls made the claims that they had been possessed by witches in early February, but when they told their parents, and especially the minister of the town, they let it go for about a month before they made any accusations. And the first accusations that they made were on outsiders. One was an invalid, one was a peasant, and then the Indian slave who was, she admitted that she was a witch, and the other two didn't. And then they were finally convicted. And then a month later after that, they accused three other women, which were of higher class. And it kept on going that through the months, more and more people, by the hundreds, were being accused of being witches. And if you look at it by the people who were accused, the people that the accused were accusing lived on the eastern part of town, and the ones that were doing the accusing lived on the western part of town. So now they claim...
And it wasn't true that it was the good Christians on the western part of town that was accusing the people that weren't too interested in going to the... Well, you know, for the Puritans, a religious day was all day from 6 in the morning till 7 at night, and throughout the week. And so some of the people just didn't like to sit in church that long, and so that was kind of the way it was. And also, what about the widows that had been left property and lands by their husbands when they had died? This was another way to get to acquire property. Just say, well, this lady is a witch, and of course, now how did they settle that? How they determine if you're a witch or not?
If you could say, actually, they would base it on the testimonies of the girls who said that they were possessed, and if.
Well, weren't you drowned?
Oh yeah, ultimately.
And not too many. I think there was only one or two burned at the stake. Most of them were drowned. And the deal was,
Hanged.
Or hanged. Okay. Well, there's a couple drowned, then mostly hanged. But the deal was, if you were accused of being a witch and you really weren't, you died. If you were really a witch, then you would live, and so. And
if you confessed that you're a witch, then you were let off the hook and you were free to go on and do whatever you want to, except you just couldn't go to church.
I think I'd have taken that one. Yeah. I wonder if they had a class for warlocks too. I'm a warlock. Okay, let's go on. Next.
Well,
Witchcraft Mark. We got to back one up here. Got to do Witchcraft Mark. Well, Mark Haskell was picked for one of the juries, and he had kind of figured out that this was probably the whole deal was a scam. And so, in the middle of one night, probably in March or April of that year, he takes off for Western Massachusetts. And this whole witchcraft stuff lasted about a year, during 1692. For some reason, he stayed out in Western Massachusetts for 6 years. He didn't come back till almost 1697 or 98.
And he left his whole family in Salem.
Yeah, and his whole family's in Salem. So anyway, I guess he didn't want to be called a warlock either. Next slide. So we'll move forward here rather quickly back into the 1800s. My great-grandfather's brother, which would be my great-great-uncle, born in 1831, I find a citation in one of the Congressional Medal of Honor directories showing that a Marcus M. Haskell won a Congressional Medal of Honor at the Battle of Antietam in Maryland during early, I think it was 1862, 1863. So the Haskells are there. Next slide. And then we have a record of a Charles M. Haskell. It's either Haskel or Heiskel. he was at the Alamo and of course died in March of 1836 and came in from Tennessee with Davy Crockett. But he's recorded. If you ever go down to San Antonio and walk around, you'll see that name up there. Whether he's a direct relation or not, I'm not sure. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. But at least it makes a good story.
We'll claim him.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, it really looks good. I've been doing some cases down in Dallas, and so all these people want to be daughters of the Texas Republic or Republic of Texas folks and so forth, and very few of them actually are descendants of anybody from the Alamo. And when I pop up and say, well, yeah, Uncle Charlie M. Haskell was at the Alamo, they get kind of upset. Can't see very well here because of the lighting. My great-grandfather, this is about 1890-ish period, and I think this is one of my great-aunts, and I don't know who some of the other people are. Next slide. This is my grandfather, grandmother, Uncle Bernie, and Dad. This is right over here is the White House on Park Avenue, the old Cannell Mansion. And this house was built about 1910. Matter of fact, Gwendolyn Myers used to babysit for Uncle Bernie way back when. Not Gwen Potter, but Gwendolyn Myers, her mother. Next slide. Another shot of the house. Next slide. And this is actually the house where Uncle Bernie was born, and my mother's house is right here, right across, and they built that about 60 years later. Again, how history repeats itself. This is downtown Rensselaer. Frank M. Haskell, my grandfather, had a barber shop right here where Jack Teedy had his barber shop for all those years, and the Schindlers had their barber shop, and it was a barber shop from, this is about probably about 1912 vintage. Next slide. This is a picture in the barber shop. Uncle Bernie knew who this was. I forget who he said he was, but there's my grandfather running the barber shop. He was a successful barber in Rensselaer for many years, and just after World War I, decided that the opportunities in agriculture were going to be great. Well, every generation has figured that, and then found out, unluckily, that it probably wasn't the case. Anyway, in about 1920, he had an opportunity to buy a farm over by Winnemac, just east of Winnemac, over by Lake Bruce. And so they moved over there, and they were doing all right after the war because there was a lot of demand for produce. Lesson to you folks here. My grandfather had a good friend who asked him to co-sign on a loan, putting the farm up as collateral. I don't care who it is, never do this. Well, this very, very good friend stuck my grandfather, and they lost the farm in 1926. They left with they had a team of horses, a wagon, the clothes on their back, and a few family heirlooms, and that was it. Luckily, my grandmother's cousins, one of them was Doc Gwynn, and one of them was Blaine Gwynn. Doc Gwynn had a farm south of Rensselaer, down by Remington, and so Grandma and Grandpa and Uncle Bernard and Dad moved to that farm, and they were there from 1926 until 1932. When they moved, then they had the opportunity to move out to the location that we're at now, east on 114. By 1937, they farmed that for 5 years, rented it, farmed it. By 1937, they had an opportunity to buy that. There was almost a 700-acre patch that was for sale. I think the whole Lawler farm sold, or a major portion of the Lawler estate sold at that time. And so Dad Bertie and bought the farm in 1937. In 1936, though, everybody's talking about this global warming. Last year was supposedly the hottest year in record, ever. I mean, when you say ever, that's 5.2 billion years for the history of the Earth. So I got some problems with that in itself. But records were set in 1936. There were 13 consecutive days in July 1936 where temperatures went over 100 degrees. And believe it or not, the Collegeville weather station set the high record for the state of Indiana of 117 on one of those days in July 1936. So, is it global warming or is it something else? I've taken several. Well, one of my major or my minor in graduate school was climatology, because I needed to know about how the temperatures and climate affected the growth and development of the insects. And I had one of only two college courses on statistical climatology that are given in the country. And the professor I had studied the temperatures across the state of Indiana and across the United States for the past 40 to 50 years. And he's a trained statistician, and he says that there's nothing to suggest there's any warming, anything outside the normal variation or variability of the temperatures that are going on. So that, I mean, we digress there quite a bit, but how we get from Hoosier homesteads to global warming, I don't know. But anyway, this is just before and it was during 1936, during that heated July summer, I think July 23rd or 24th, that my grandfather died. The heat killed him, as we saw in Chicago a few years ago. Here's Uncle Bernie as a young lad. My grandfather, we're at the farm on 114 at this point. Next slide. Can't see that, but that's the shocks of wheat out in the field. Thrashing time. Uncle Bernie was telling about the story at the time when they must have had 10 or 12 teams of wagons and so forth, and a big storm came up. And he said there were wagons torn up, scattered. 2 teams were found over 2.5 to 3 miles away when they finally stopped running. The team stampeded all over the place because the lightning bolts and thunder scared them. But and now we're progressing. We're back about 1939, and Dad had just gotten a new elevator. They got a new elevator to fill the corn crib and a wagon hoist, and this is modern times. Next. Of course, even those modern times, things broke, right? And so Dad's up fixing the elevator. 1939 again, my dad, my grandmother, and Uncle Bernie. This little lad, next picture. This is, we're kind of shirt-tailed cousins of some of the Parkers. And this was one of the group of Parkers that they had moved to Chicago. He was a businessman in Chicago, but he had 4 boys. Here are the 4 boys, Wayne, Wendell, Wes, and Wiley Parker. And so in the summers, they'd send them down to the farm because we had plenty of food, had eggs and places to play and so forth. And this is our new Formal F20 tractor they bought in 1937. Uncle Bernie told about how they made the payment on that tractor by picking. I think he picked corn up at Fair Oaks Farms for 6 weeks. And he said one time he picked all day on one 40-acre piece and didn't fill the wagon. That's how bad the corn was during that time. And there's Uncle Bernie on the farm all. Next slide. And that's our Hoosier Homestead Award Day. That's my son Joel, Uncle Bernie, myself, Mom, Chrissy, and now Governor Frank O'Bannon. That's the conclusion of our presentation. Do we have any questions, comments, discussions? Anybody want to talk about global warming or the chinch bug epidemic in 1936 or the flu epidemic of 1918 or things like that?
You didn't fully explain your occupation. Why don't you do that?
Oh, okay. I used to be a farmer, but what I do now is I went back to graduate school and received a master's and PhD in a field called forensic entomology. And so I travel North America as a private consultant investigating murders, and in particular advanced decomposing death murders. And I just returned from our National Forensic Conference in San Francisco this week, where I was just sitting, honest to God, we do a lot of talking. At these conferences, it's not so much all the presentations you see during the day, but you get to the lounges or the foyers and you sit down and talk over things with folks, colleagues and so forth, and you discuss research and you discuss cases and those kind of things. It's a lot of fun. And so I was in the lobby of the Hotel Hilton in San Francisco, and I was talking about maggots and decomposing bodies to this forensic anthropologist that was sitting there. And this lady comes up to me and says, "Are you with the conference?" I says, "Yes, ma'am, I am." She says, "I'm with America's Most Wanted." I says, "I didn't do anything, honest." She said, "No." She says, "What are you talking about?" I says, "I don't think you want to know." And she said, "No, yeah, what are you talking about?" I said, "Well, I'm actually talking about maggots and skeletonized bodies." "Oh, wonderful. Would you mind putting on a microphone, and we'd like for you and your colleague to continue talking. We're going to go over here and film this." So according to her, I'm supposed to be on America's Most Wanted Saturday. So if anybody watches that, maybe you'll see me on that. But anyway, the agriculture, the farming was extremely challenging. it's a heck of a way to earn a living, and you folks that are out there doing that are doing a heck of a job. Hopefully we're in a period of time when interest rates are going to be a little lower, and our demand for our products are going to be up worldwide, and so we can, you folks that are still farming can hopefully make a little income. I chose not to continue that, and what I do is extremely challenging and fun and stressful at times, but not nearly as bad as stressful when we get drought in farming times when I was doing the farming. So,
In 1936, when they had that chinch
yes, exactly. 35, 30. I think there were 3 years that the chinch bugs were just horrible. And again, Uncle Bernie told about taking creosote, and you'd put creosote you'd take your tractor, your team of horses, I guess, and you'd take a big tube, or take a big railroad tie or something, put creosote on it, drag something behind it, and try to put a coating of creosote around your wheat and so forth. Am I thinking right there?
I thought it was in the early 30s. I didn't
Yeah. Yeah, it was.
How wide an area was that? Was that kind of wide, or?
Oh, that was Midwest. Throughout the Illinois, Iowa, over into Ohio, of course, Indiana. But it was, and it was. I think it was primarily a lot of times the insect things are conditions brought on by weather conditions and other things like the drought of the 30s. I think caused that thing the chinch bugs to be established like that. Such as that real wet period of time we had the year we had the cornleaf blight.
Then they came out with wheat, and then
Yeah.
anything is green.
That's exactly right. And they just suck it dry.
We had 2 horses die.
Is that right? Wow.
It was probably from just
Yeah. Any other comments, questions? Yes.
I was a young kid, so I was behind the horse, leading the, driving the, I think we used a big log.
A big log to make with the creosote on it, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that's what that log coming down a fur up.
Yeah, but
Okay, right.
Then they put creosote along the road.
Uh-huh.
But when the chinch bugs got going, they could fly right over.
Right. They're winged in the adult stage. Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.